So I don't want to steal any of Tim's thunder, and nor do I want to stand right in front of him as I'm doing this brief intro. But the list of things that are critical, I mean, we've gone through this morning and early this afternoon's discussions. The list is long and very challenging, whether it's load growth, energy resource mix changes, decarbonization goals from state and federal policymakers, permitting and siting challenges, labor force supply chain costs, and consumer impacts are all parts of the evolving energy system. And this group is going to try and unpack and answer many of those questions, and if I know Tim, a few more in the next hour. So with that, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you haven't logged on to menti.com and put in the code, please do, because that's how it'll allow you to engage with the panel through questions that we will send to you if we get any good ones. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And you may want to buckle up. The last time I was on stage, I'm a little bit out of habit, and I inadvertently called a bunch of CEOs liars, and nobody liked that. So I promise the F's of people I won't do that today. But it is, this is a very hot button issue, and glad to have all the panelists with us to kind of tackle it. The first thing I want to do is just kind of turn the floor over to all of you. This might be the only question that I would like to hear from everyone on, if possible. But I just want you guys to give everyone a quick diagnosis of what is happening with the sudden projections for all this demand growth in electricity. Data centers, manufacturing, EVs, artificial intelligence. What do you all think is actually the biggest factor, if there is a standout, driving these new expectations?
I'll go first, I guess. Driving them, I think you listed what's driving load growth or projected load growth. And I think we're just starting to see that it's very conservative. I think we're going to see significantly greater increases. But for me, I guess the crux is resource adequacy. Is for 4 decades we've had flat load growth, and then now you have you have this massive shift towards lower emitting and clean energy, clean electricity, now coupled with potentially exponential load growth. Where do the electrons come from? And I think it's an emerging issue. It's one that policymakers just aren't focused on yet, but we need to.
I'll go next. I don't know if we all introduced ourselves, so Chris, maybe you want to introduce yourself in case folks don't know who you are.
That's a great point.
Okay.
Hi. Christopher Guith from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Great, and I'm Brianne Miller with Microsoft, and I think Tim and Chris kind of laid out why I'm here on the panel today. Data centers are driving a lot of the load growth in our country. We're at a really fortunate place where our business is growing. We're super excited that more people are plugging into the cloud, and that AI is really having, AI has been around for a long time, but seems to really be having a moment now. I think the resource adequacy is really the big point here, right? The flat growth we've had, or flat growth is not a thing, maybe just the flat electricity demand we've had for many years. I was just talking with Chris earlier when you used to call the utility and say, hey, I have this much load, when can I plug in? It wasn't a if, it was a when. And now I think it's becoming a little bit more challenging as we see there's more scarcity in the electricity space. So that would be one of the things that I would be thinking about.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derrick Kualapai. I represent the Plumbers and Pipefitters Union. And so my answer is going to be sort of from a labor's perspective. We see politicians in D.C. Pushing this narrative of just transition and what that means for us and in the labor movement and the work that is before us. And I think there's a high sense of anxiety of what that is going to look like, especially when we talk about things like CCS and hydrogen. Lots and lots of moving parts. Everybody's positioning to make their product come to service. And so we sit back as labor ready to deploy the manpower that all of you are going to utilize in your different sectors to build the infrastructure that you're looking to get on board with. And so we see it from a labor perspective, a huge push from the politicians, but with that, this high sense of anxiety as far as where we're all going to land in terms of labor.
So I'm Diane Burman. I'm a New York State Public Service Commissioner. The last time I looked, the reason I say that is back in my state, the woman who's going to be potentially replacing me is going to go before the Senate to be confirmed. So I may turn back into, the Cinderella afterwards. I think just for me, I kind of need to level set. I think that we all agree that power demand is rising, electrification of transportation and buildings is driving significant load growth. In New York, like many states, we've articulated this vision of an energy future through our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and that's 5 years old right now. And this vision is one that's including reducing greenhouse gas emissions and accompanying increases in renewable energy. And it's also a vision of decreasing the use of fossil fuels. And there's a lot of drivers that are really sort of moving us forward in our policies and legislation, while well-meaning, that is really, I think, causing, a lot of consternation, a lot of confusion, a lot of concern. And as these policies are moving, they're not static, right? So there's further legislation that is becoming very prescriptive, that is lessening the flexibility for regulators and for industry, and also causing sort of this, wait and see, right? So we heard today, I'm sorry, I'm not really answering you, but I'm going to answer what the question that I think is really, the elephants in the room are, kind of the elephants in the room for me is, we are recognizing that we are not going to meet these targets in the way that we thought so, right? So what does that mean? Now, you heard on the RTO panel, I think the greatest ISO CEO currently, which is Rich Dewey, saying that what keeps him up at night is that in 2032, in 8 years, that we may have an issue. Well, so for a lot of people, they hear that and say, we got time, right? 8 years. Most people don't recognize that that means that today we have an issue. Today we need to understand not only that the time frame of 8 years is probably actually a lot faster, because as we've seen, the data centers, AI, everything has also all of a sudden made it that much more. What we thought in New York recently was that we would anticipate annual electricity growth of 100 to 110% by 2050. Probably much, much more than that now. So for me, I don't think we have the luxury of allowing it just to be Rich Dewey's problem of what keeps him up at night. We have to actually now start talking about the true realization of how are we going to level set this in a way that keeps us on a responsible path forward. I disagree with Jason Grummett, who said that we're not on track, and that means that we may have to be more aggressive. We are not on track, but what we have to be aggressive about is the aggressive drilling down on the planning issues, the operational issues, and looking at what are the different pathways. It's not about, we're going to just keep moving forward because we want to meet those deadlines. The deadlines may not be actually sufficient or appropriate.
So Diane, help us to understand, just for starters, how this is playing out in New York since you're there on the front lines. It sounds like what you're saying is this is mostly, for now, obviously there are things to come, but for now it sounds like you're saying that the early drivers have been policy. There are subsidies out there for electric vehicles. There are new requirements on electrification for buildings, and that's what's the spear tip of all the demand growth in electricity that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's that and more. I think that the reality is that part of the issue is, so as I sit as a state regulator at the moment, I've been looking at this and saying, we need to talk about the realism, right? So there is a need for us to figure out how we're going to do this so that we are honest brokers. We have to look at it from the perspective of, all right, the value is in energy planning with the right technical folks, the right stakeholders, the right folks who can help us address the challenges of extreme weather, address the challenges of intermittent generation, address the challenges of moving from a summer to a winter peaking grid, address the challenges of natural gas system constraints. Jason Grummett said that it is not controversial that natural gas is needed in our energy future. It is controversial in New York, and it shouldn't be. And therefore, we have a challenge because part of the assumptions on our policies have been on, we're going to get rid of gas. We're not getting rid of gas. And it would be inappropriate and woefully irresponsible to do that. But that doesn't mean that we're just staying the same. It means that we have to figure out how to integrate it in a way that makes sense with our desire to have more renewables onto our system.
Can everybody hear me now? I have this. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, which is a great sign. Thank you all for your patience. Christopher, I want to come to you for a second here. And we'll definitely get into the gas issue and the zero emissions target issue more in a minute. But before we get into some future-looking things, I want to dig a little bit more into just what's happening now, what has happened already. Kind of, if you could, maybe help us understand where we're seeing this demand growth pop up already. Are there any places around the country or any industries that you see that have been at the head of this, where there's been the most dramatic growth already?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I deal with hundreds of chambers a year, and I think there's almost uniformity. You're seeing it everywhere, but certainly more so in the South and the Southeast. If you look at load growth projections, the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic are bordering on exponential. To the point where now, like, the local chamber is having to say, wait a second, we have all these visions for becoming the destination for EV manufacturing or a data center for blockchain. We never really thought, as has been discussed, where the electrons are coming from. And looking at the utilities, how many times they have to update their integrated resource plans in such short intervals. I mean, this is just coming like a deluge, and I think people are just kind of waking up to it yet. But it's being led by manufacturing that's being spurred by the IRA, by the CHIPS and Science Act, and frankly, dirt cheap gas. It's a huge competitive advantage compared to the rest of the world. Sitting here, it's roughly $1.60 a million BTU. Even in Europe, where things are basically calm right now, it's more than 4 or 5 times that. So that's a huge driver, given the infrastructure is mostly in the Southeast, and you also have other favorable conditions. That's where most of it is. I won't say most. That's where it stands out as being the leader in where most of this development is occurring.
I think you used a phrase that some are waking up to this, and I want to get into that a little bit because this issue of demand growth in electricity and how we haven't seen it in so long, and the complex problems that come with it. As it's been in the news, I've sensed surprise from people, even in the industry, from some with utilities, grid operators, certainly members of the energy and climate community at large. But as long as I've been an energy and climate reporter, we're talking, I think, for more than a decade now, the rallying cry has been around, first electrify everything, basically, and then clean up the electric grid. And the strategy had long been, well, it's a lot easier to deploy wind and solar on the grid than it is to figure out how to prevent emissions from mobile sources from gasoline burning cars. So are we just in a situation now? And so I'm kind of trying to figure out, okay, so why has this caught everyone by surprise that demand growth would, one, be an outcome of that? And then two, have we now that this is all really seemingly happening, have we kind of walked ourselves into a situation where, hey, we are electrifying, but we're not taking care of the other half of the equation in cleaning up the grid fully along with that?
Yes, quite clearly. I think it's important, and hopefully this audience more than anyone appreciates this. Job number one is reliability. I mean, even above cost, even above emissions, because when you don't have reliable power, that's when you lose your license to operate. That's when you have utter chaos in society. And I think even with the electrification push, it has been gradual. And so, you know, you can keep up with that. But then when you have all these policy drivers, starting with IIJA, Chips and Science Act, and IRA, that is really accelerating the load growth. And that doesn't even take into account, you know, pending regulation of pushing the transportation sector towards electrification, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to site a new gas plant, with the promise of potentially going after existing gas plants in a second term. I love Commissioner Diane's point. It's about realism. I mean, at some point you have to appreciate you can't just imagine electrons and molecules. You actually have to find a way to generate them and a way to transmit them to where they need to be. And I think that's what we're going to hear a lot of over the next 2 years is realism. I mean, there wasn't a single CEO at CERAWeek last week who didn't make some sort of comment. Whether they were European, Asian, American, it's time to be realistic, because otherwise we are going to fall short of supply.
So I want to circle back to Diane's point about gas and how it is still controversial in a lot of places. I think I read that Kansas is even thinking of switching over or keeping a coal burning plant open to deal with the demand. And in some states, and I think even the United Kingdom, there is a consideration of plans that would invest taxpayer dollars in gas. Christopher, I know you said that this is realism. Does anyone else up here feel that maybe the utilities should have been better positioned for this, or that there would have been a way to be more prepared and have other alternatives, cleaner energy ready to go, transmission projects going more in advance to avert this possibility?
I mean, I think transmission in general continues to be a challenge, and rather than putting it just on the utilities, I think thinking about, I often think about just through the lens of permitting reform and what needed to be done to speed up infrastructure development across the board in this country is key, and something that we're still struggling with. I think, you know, I worked in energy policy for over a decade on the Hill before I came over to Microsoft, and I think I did permitting reform every year, Chris, with you. So it's one of those perennial issues that we just can't seem to solve. And I think without that, we're in these timelines, like the commissioner noted, where we're not going to reach what we need to reach. And so thinking in practicalities, like if we can think of these big things like are the utilities to blame, who's to blame? At this point, it's kind of beyond blame. We just need to figure it out, and we need to solve the problem. And I think solving it in some kind of stages is going to be key. I don't know how you feel.
Well, I don't really, I mean, yeah, it's easy. You want to pick on the utilities? Let's pick on the utilities. You want to pick on the industry? Let's pick on the industry. You want to pick on the regulators? Let's pick on the regulators. Like, who's to blame? Forget about that for a minute. The reality is we know, and are people surprised? Anyone that has any real expertise should not be surprised. So if you want to call them liars, we'll call them liars.
Not me. I'm not calling anyone a liar today. I've already made that clear.
Let's get back to who suffers from this and how do we address it, right? So the reality is, to me, I am not criticizing. I want to go fast, but I want to actually make sure that we're doing the right thing. The policies the targets are important to have for some, you know, this is what we'd like to do, right? I would like to have, you know, a lot of things. The reality is now we have to figure out how do we do this, what makes sense, what do we need to give up, what are the balancing opportunities that we need. For when we're in New York and we have our 5-year CLCPA, it's not static. There's all these other legislations, all these other things. It keeps changing. It keeps changing on what it is. It started out 5 years ago that the CLCPA was not anti-gas. It's now been interpreted that it's anti-gas. The reality is that the only thing we're focused on in New York with the CLCPA is these gosh darn timelines. We're forgetting about the two big factors in that CLCPA was reliability is paramount. It's not a backstop. It's actually the threshold issue that we need to contend with. Second thing is, it wasn't supposed to be, we're supposed to have this stakeholder engagement with this wide variety from this advisory council that was supposed to give us this final scoping plan, which was not supposed to be the be-all and end-all. Instead, that became the be-all and end-all. It was supposed to then go and get put forward to our state energy planning board, which has the technical expertise, which has a lot of other legislative requirements that give the technical and operational soundness to it, and flesh out what makes sense. What can we do? And the reality is that, say, well, so what if you don't meet the timelines? No, the real question is, it's not about the timelines, but what it is that if we know that now and we're going to be putting at risk reliability, what signal are we sending? What signal are we sending to industry? Are we serious about the timelines? Are we not serious? Are we serious about reliability? Are we not serious? Reality is, for me, is we actually have to accept responsibility as a state for us making sure that we go back and level set in true policy planning and system energy planning that makes sense. Because the value for us is that if we do it, we will have more economic opportunities and more ability to actually really achieve a lot of good things, not only in our state, but in other states.
So, Diane, it sounds like you're really excited to talk about timelines. And so I have a timeline question. Does this mean, especially the trend to the re-embrace of gas-fired power, does that doom a lot of the timelines that have been promised, 2035, 2040, 2050? We heard Jason talk a little bit about this earlier. Do you all think that it's impossible to hit some of those 2035 zero emissions targets and maybe even 2040 and beyond?
We have no idea. I mean, nobody could have predicted the United States leading the world in emissions reductions. But, we stumbled upon hydraulic fracturing and became the largest gas producer in the world. I mean, it's just simple math. I mean, gas is and will remain the backbone of a clean energy economy. I mean, first it pushed coal out, and now it backstops renewables. I mean, until there's a storage solution, there's an arithmetic ceiling for renewable penetration before reliability gets jeopardized. And I mean, that's just the simple reality. Having said that, I have no idea what tomorrow looks like. We didn't predict the shale revolution, and fusion's always a day away. So who knows? That was tongue in cheek, by the way.
No, I get you. Brian, do you think that the public should still believe that the corporate sector is going to meet some of these timelines they promised?
Yeah, we've committed to being carbon negative by 2030, a variety of other things, and also removing all of our historical emissions by 2050. Do we set those goals because we thought they were easy? No, we know they're stretch goals. We know that we're going to have to rise to the challenge, and we're continuing to do that in a variety of ways, whether it's driving efficiencies through our own business or leading the carbon dioxide removal market through some of our work there. I mean, we're going to keep trying to reach these goals in any way we can. I think that's one thing to think about with the data center industry. Since the advent of data centers, we've watched the efficiency factor, really improve each year with data centers. And although AI is new and we're learning how that energy use is done, I would anticipate the same kind of innovation is going to happen. We're not in a static space all the time, so it'll be interesting to kind of see where we can go.
If I could just riff here for a second, I think as a reporter who covers the space, some of the points you're all touching on, are real conundrums in terms of reporting and in terms of what the public understands, because there is clearly an impetus to set timelines in order to raise the bar high, and maybe government and the corporate sector don't meet it, but you set aspirational timelines to help you at least achieve a lot, even if you don't quite get over the bar. Yeah. But sometimes that gets lost with the public, especially in an era where there's increased alienation. The general public has lost faith in institutions, and there is this, I get this, often got this sense from readers that they're just lying to us, and this is ridiculous, and there's a real risk that, yes, you set these aspirational timelines, but it risks the public trust. Anyway, that's just a long-winded way of me saying like these are interesting things, and making a transition.
That's a pretty big riff.
Yeah, sorry, and making a transition into talking a little bit more about the public and some of the broader implications here outside of just utilities and how they operate and how we all acquire power, and bring Derrick a little more into the discussion here. You're here to represent the union viewpoint, and that's often one that is really powerful here in Washington, especially these days. And the situation that we're talking about, where there is a projected huge demand on the way and not the infrastructure to meet that demand, seems like it would be really good for unions, a really good situation for you and all of your workers. But I'd love to hear you give your assessment of that and just kind of like give us your read on your membership and maybe even the working public at large of what they want in the response to all these issues that we're talking about.
Sure, thank you. So I think the first part of that question can be answered by permitting reform. I mean, we've got bipartisan infrastructure law, IRA, and CHIPS, still trying to figure out what CCS and hydrogen can look like for us as a labor union and how we're going to deploy manpower. So certainly our workers would like to see some permitting reform. Our workers want to go to work. They want to build these facilities and infrastructure that all of you are in charge of. Listen, you asked a question earlier about whether or not it was the utility or regulator's fault as far as where we're currently at. I pull no punches when I say that, quite frankly, from labor's perspective, that the conundrum that we're in, that was a word that was used here just a couple of seconds ago, really falls on the heels of extreme environmentalism. I'll talk about it all day because I do talk about it all day. They are the creators of where we're at as an industry. They do a very good job with convincing politicians, and in our case, that wind and solar needs to be the baseload energy needs for the future. Unfortunately, that narrative right there puts my union out of the equation, because we do one thing that we've done very well for 135 years, and that's build piping systems. This narrative of just transition, by the way, I come from California, born and raised, recently moved out here to DC 2 years ago to work at my headquarters. I watched the very first municipality, Berkeley, California, you guys are all aware of it, banning natural gas piping in buildings and government buildings, things of that sort. And then, of course, political article comes out yesterday that the city of Berkeley is going to walk that back a little bit because of lawsuits. Here's the environmentalist from labor's perspective definition of just transition. It's, let's take Derrick Kualapai's union, 375,000 members in the United States and Canada, and let's give them millions and millions and millions of dollars to retrain them to build wind and solar. We will never do that. We're not chartered to do that. There are unions that do that work, and great for them. But for our union, we do one thing, and that's build piping systems. And so I've sat down with the Sierra Club, the NRDC, and the EDF in California to try to come to some common ground on, you can't just legislate your way into making a difference. Does it spur the conversation? Absolutely it does. But you have to be willing to sit down, and we heard the word stakeholders. Believe it or not, labor is a stakeholder. And we were never invited. The United Association of Plumbers and Pipefitters were never invited to the table with the environmentalists to sit down and say, what does just transition look like for you? The answer to that question for us is the all-above approach to energy. That's the answer, because we can land in those spaces, whether it's CCS, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's SMRs, whether it's geothermal, waste to energy, you pick it. We can land in that space. But what we cannot allow, and what labor will not allow, is extreme environmentalists dictating the narrative of where common working folks like ourselves that are on the tools day in and day out paint what that picture looks like.
So I think the question of environmental groups is really interesting here because I'm not sure that we would see the decarbonization goals that we're talking about here in the equation if it weren't for a lot of effort from those groups to get the utility sector, to get Wall Street, to get state utility commissions to care about, to prioritize your net zero goals. This is an effort that went on for years and years and has led to a lot of progress on emissions targets nationwide. But there is, I think what happens in the future is a major question, and I want to hear you all give your diagnosis of that, because there are plenty of groups that are climate focused and are supporters of what utility regulators and utilities themselves and consumers are doing in trying to balance these things and move towards a lower carbon grid. But there are also plenty of environmental groups who, in the history going back to the 70s, their impetus more is just to stop projects and stop building. And there's this major question: will environmentalists on the whole, will environmental groups get behind the need to build all this infrastructure, or will some of their proclivities to just stop development get in the way? So I'd love to hear you all give your assessment of what direction you see that going in the next 10 to 15 years.
Tim, if I can,
Derrick,
that's a great segue to, we've started to answer part of this question. And, when I sat down with the big three to figure out, hey, listen, you folks are pushing this narrative. Wind and solar doesn't work for the UA, United Association. What could we do to collaborate? And so we started having this conversation about, well, Derrick, so my argument was, you're going to push politicians to legislate away equity that my members would typically be involved in, piping equity, building piping systems. And so I said to them, I said, if you're going to go down this path where you're going to legislate away the equity of plumbing and pipe fitting, you ought to be able to have a conversation with us and ask us, what does that look like? And I could have easily said to them, and this answers part of your question, if you're going to take away equity, be prepared to give us equity. And they said, well, give us an example. And I said, okay, look, if, we really all know what the answer to this is, but if we are going to wean off fossil fuels, if that's where we're headed, and the United Association, is set to lose man hours because we're no longer building these piping systems, why couldn't you folks, the big three, why couldn't you folks get behind rainwater harvesting and gray water reuse in buildings? You're willing to take gas piping out of buildings, but will you be willing to help us legislate and advocate for rainwater harvesting and gray water reuse? And they said, oh, wow, what a novel idea. We could actually trade off one for the other. And for us, those piping systems are actually double the amount of work. So, in terms of the industry, in terms of gas piping, could that ever really happen? I think there was an example there of an opportunity for labor and the environmentalists to really collaborate on something innovative.
Brian, can I have you touch this one a little bit? You're the one up here representing a company who's actually who needs things to be built. Do you all feel right now that the environmental movement largely is behind you and supportive of the clean energy build out you need, or do you feel they're more likely to be in opposition?
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question. I certainly haven't thought about it in those terms. Microsoft's one of the biggest corporate purchasers of clean energy in the world. We've purchased just over 19 gigawatts of clean energy over the past few years. We're focused on, we recently released a report focused on advanced reactors and fusion energy and our support for policies around there. We've invested, or we have a PPA for fusion energy. We're all over the energy map, and I wouldn't say we get pushback. I think we try to do this in a pragmatic way when we select the projects we're working on and think, long-term, short-term, long-term. medium term as well as on the carbon removal front. So I don't usually think about it in those terms.
Even a nuclear, I feel like you guys have been fairly big supporters of nuclear too, and that was often a non-starter in that community. Has that changed a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'll harken back to my time before Microsoft. When I was on Capitol Hill, I think we saw a huge shift in nuclear over the last 10 years, and with the passing of legislation, NECA, NEMA, and NELA, because nobody on Capitol Hill is inventive with our names. It's the nuclear energy and then some letters after it, acts. We saw huge bipartisan support, and I think that bipartisan support was coming from people like Senator Whitehouse, Senator Booker, Senator Murkowski, Senator Risch. I mean, this is a broad swath of folks who have a lot of interests across the board with different groups. I think nuclear is becoming much more neutral in a lot of these environmental groups.
I'm going to get to solutions in 1 second, but I do want to ask a relatively complex question first that brings labor back into the equation and sort of touches on the foundation that we've set to move forward in this area. I think, and kind of touches on the globalization issue too, because there has been, I think there's a pretty widely held belief in this town right now that to address the climate question, you in some ways have to address the labor question and the China question all simultaneously. That is almost the very premise of the IRA and the Biden agenda on electrification, that you will lose support from voters, from a broad swath of Americans, if you cannot convince them that a lot of the climate agenda is going to help the U.S. economy, is going to make the U.S. economy more competitive, and do that primarily by making sure that the country is competing with China on battery manufacturing, on EV manufacturing. But then, as Christopher, you alluded to before, that's become one of the drivers for the demand growth that we're talking about here. That you've got now that we are pumping a bunch of money back into domestic manufacturing in particular, it's leading to all this anticipated new demand for electricity that is then kind of leading back to this embrace of natural gas. And so, sorry, I know if that got a little complicated, just imagine the proverbial snake eating itself. And so I just want to hear from you all about that sort of premise that is built into the policy that we have out there now to deal with electrification, to deal with the greening of the grid. Have we created some sort of like self-immolating doom loop or some sort of vicious cycle where the policy and the political goals demand too much from the U.S. economy all at once?
The short answer is no. I mean, the political angle, I mean, if you look at poll after poll, the vast majority of Americans appreciate that the climate is changing and that there are things we need to do in order to mitigate that. You talked about targets before. Targets are aspirational. They need to be realistic. They can't be suicide pacts. I've got hundreds of members, present company included, who have made net zero commitments. Almost none of them know how they're going to get there. It's a bet on future technology, and that's the important part. You can't decarbonize any faster than the pace of innovation. And the International Energy Agency itself, which isn't exactly Fox News material, they estimate that roughly 50% of the technologies needed to decarbonize the global economy don't exist yet. And that doesn't mean you don't exploit the 50% that do, but you have to be realistic about how you're going to get the other 50% and what the pace that is, what pace that's going to be at. I mean, we've touched a little bit about permitting, but I think that's the key part here, because in spite of the bumper sticker that DC is more divisive now than ever, you still saw IIJA, you still saw CHIPS and Science, which were both bipartisan, and then the IRA, which, while not bipartisan by definition, if you look at the climate provisions and you squint, it looks like a bipartisan compromise. So those are huge, and this goes to your point about, who do you blame for this? Well, these are good things. We have demand coming from these legislative changes. But the third pole, or the third leg in that stool is permitting reform. I mean, right now we've got about, 5.5 million miles of transmission line in this country. The National Academies of Science estimate we're going to need 1 million more to decarbonize by 2050. I mean, we're building at the rate of about 650 miles a year, and none of them are interstate transmission lines because it's virtually impossible to site them. Same is true on let's just say gas pipelines. The National Academies estimate that we're needing about 40,000 additional miles of pipe just for CO2 and or hydrogen. That doesn't even take into account natural gas. But we're at a point now where it literally takes an act of Congress to site an interstate natural gas pipeline. I do think, to your point about working with the environmental group, that we're at a point where the shoe's on the other foot now. These bedrock laws that are considered sacrosanct were considered sacrosanct because they were used to stop projects that environmentalists didn't like. But now they're increasingly stopping the projects they do like. I mean, when you can have Ed Markey and Ted Cruz both say that we need permanent reform, that's something I can work with. They're obviously coming at it from vastly different points, but we're not going to get it unless we have 60 votes anyway. So eventually, people need to sit down and act like adults. And I think we're getting closer and closer as I think the environmental community realizes just the sheer size and nature of what needs to happen.
Derrick, can I have you address this too? Do you feel at all that there's a risk that the country's bitten off more than it can chew by trying to promote domestic manufacturing at the same time it's promoting, reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
I'm also going to say in short order, no. Here's another narrative that's out there, and that's we don't have enough workers to build these projects. That, folks, comes from the Business Roundtable on the non-union side. And I'll tell you where the genesis of that is. Contractors that work in the non-union side are looking for the cheapest labor they can find. In fact, all contractors are, but here I'm going to pick on them just a little bit because I want to draw this point. There is a shortage of $10 and $12 an hour residential workers in the United States. That is true. And the reason why there's a shortage of $10 and $12 residential construction workers is because a lot of those workers now have realized they have an opportunity to join a union. And I can confidently sit here and tell you that since 2016, my union in particularly have recruited over 100,000 of those workers, going from a $12 an hour job to a starting pay of $28 to a high of $70 on the check. That's just what it is. And people are making the decision not to work for low wages anymore. So there's this narrative that there's not enough construction workers out there. I want to guarantee you all that there is enough construction workers out there. My union has them. So the short answer is no, but that's the explanation.
So I want to get into solutions, and you may all not be able to believe this, but the audience has a lot of questions and about the tech industry in particular. Oh. So I think, Brianne, I want to come to you for this part. And maybe before we get to solutions exactly, there was this question we got from the audience that I think is really interesting, because some of the and I hear this from the environmental community too. There's some criticism about the source of demand. Do we need this? Does AI in particular need to be such a demand suck? I mean, obviously you guys aren't Bitcoin miners, but Bitcoin gets thrown into this a lot too. And one of the audience questions was about data centers in the same light, and asking, well, what's the alternative, basically? Should this investment not be made? I can't imagine that you would say no, but I guess how do you explain that to people? Why do we need this much more capacity?
Sure, yeah. So everybody in this room has a device with them. Most of you have checked it at some point while we've been up here on this panel, whichever part didn't interest you, or when it buzzed, or when you were checking your Facebook or your Instagram along the way. All that data lives somewhere. It doesn't live in a cloud. It lives in a data center. Those data centers are in high demand, and our capacity in those data centers are in high demand. We're a 5 nines industry. We have to be reliable 99.999% of the time for our customers, who are Microsoft's customers. We've got hospitals, we have the federal government, we have companies, We have industry, we have new advanced manufacturing that we help power on our Azure platform. We're enabling the economy. So it's not always, some people are like, oh, it's like my grandma's cat video. Like, that's not what it is, right? Like, AI can do so many amazing things to help drive efficiencies that, yes, there's an increase in energy use. Can we balance that out with sustainability? With Sarah Week last week, I don't know if any of you were there, we had a booth down in the Agora where we had folks walking through how we're using it to help folks do digital twins of their grid to help speed up interconnections. And we have people who are looking at just grid operations in general. We're looking at permitting reform, but we're doing it from the licensing side on nuclear, where we're looking at how do you speed up NRC licensing process, which can be hundreds of millions of dollars and many years of a process. What can we do using AI and large language models to speed that up? The opportunities are really endless on what we can do there. And so is it an if or a then? We are a digital economy. We're going to continue driving a digital economy. We have to continue to compete with countries around the world. It's just going to be a part of our lives.
And there's just no way to do that without tremendous demand growth.
Well, I think the more data centers you need, like we were already in a period of demand growth, right, with our data centers, like that's customer demand to us. If customers demand data centers and want cloud operations, then we have to interconnect somewhere. So we'll need demand growth. But like I said in the very beginning, we try to find efficiencies in everything we do, and we try to drive those efficiencies every day so that we can get lower energy use as a part of this.
And in this country, we still champion free enterprise.
Yeah.
Companies going out
We do?
and trying to create jobs and generate economic growth it's a good thing.
Okay. There are some people questioning that these days. Like, do we need exponential growth forever? I just want to put that out there. So
Well,
yes.
Maybe the premise
No,
is
Diane.
wrong. Maybe the premise is wrong, though, that the premise that this is now a pivot on, now we're going to go back to needing gas and nuclear. Maybe the premise, the underlying assumptions on the initial policy goals and targets were based on faulty assumptions, and that now looking at it, it's really about going back to our core responsibility of ensuring that we are focused on a reliable, affordable, and safe grid and what that means. And so the fact that even now in New York, where a few years ago, we shut down Indian Point nuclear plant, we're now talking about perhaps nuclear now being part of the mix, right? What does that look like? And so for me, that actually shows, see, it's not about sort of saying this is good, that's bad, because perhaps all of it needs to be considered and all solutions looked at and what makes sense. We're going to start now sort of trying to figure out how to incorporate nuclear. We also have to talk about the elephants in the room of some of the subsidies that have been very focused on solar and wind that actually may not be able to have small modular nuclear be sustainable in New York.
So some of the other questions we got from the audience were all sort of, they're all thematic around tech and solutions, whether data centers can be a big element in demand response programs. What about the future role of energy efficiency in progress there? I've heard environmental groups make similar claims that more could be done with batteries or shifting consumers or I should say, we're pushing consumers to shift their demand away from peak hours. How much potential is there for these types of creative solutions to address these issues?
I think that the time for creativity is now. Just last week, Microsoft announced a partnership with Nucor and Google. We're calling it an advanced market commitment, where we're going to try to aggregate our demand to spur kind of investment in first-of-a-kind technologies like advanced geothermal, advanced nuclear, long-duration energy storage, things that aren't 5 years out but are maybe like 5 to 10 years out, and try to kind of spur that development and growth. There's an open RFI if any of your companies are in any of those businesses. I'm happy to send you the information there. But we're trying anything to be creative. You don't often see Microsoft and Google, coming together to work in these spaces, but we're excited to be working with Nucor as well. Nucor has a more flexible load than Google and Microsoft. And so as we aggregate our demand and think about that, like that's a creative solution. Is how do we fund these new projects that could be the game changer for the grid? What does that look like? I think trying to be creative, this is the time.
And the energy industry was one of, if not the first industry to really start to exploit artificial intelligence. Certainly the generation side, I mean, at the end of the day, you need to figure out how an electron goes from point A to point B. Well, there could be an infinite number of ways for that to happen, but there could be the optimal way for it to happen. And to ensure that efficiency, but even more than that, oil and gas. I mean, there's a reason why global markets have been vexed for the last 2 years by continued US output. And it's because they've been partnering with companies like Microsoft for the last 5-6 years to figure out how to more efficiently get those molecules out of the ground. More efficiency means lower emissions. It also means more product. So now we continue to drive global supply, and it's some of the cleanest barrels in the world. Some people may not like it, but we need oil. The world needs oil. It's going to for a long time. It needs gas. We've already talked about that. And being able to get more of it out of the ground more cleanly, I mean, that's a net benefit.
Yeah, Diane, please.
So I think that we all probably agree that innovation, innovative solutions, technology is really necessary as we're looking forward in a clean energy future, right? And understanding that, one of the challenges, at least in New York, is our Rich Dewey, our ISO, had talked about the fact that they came up with the term DEFRs, the dispatchable emission-free resources, right? And looking at that, we rely on our New York ISO to help us with reliability studies as we're looking at what we're doing, making sure that we're doing it responsibly. What are some of that? Part of the difficulty for folks who, and we're going to have to scale up, we need investment. Part of the difficulty for folks leaning in here is they're not even sure what we're going to find acceptable as technology as it connects to CLCPA or climate leadership, right? So we're not giving them direction in what is a dispatchable emission-free resources. And so we're expecting them to keep being on the sidelines waiting, but they're supposed to be ready to go, but they can't even do that in any way when we, as the state regulator, haven't yet come to a decision that makes sense. We opened a docket, we're having comments, all that's great, but we don't have the luxury of letting them sit on the sidelines waiting for us to act, especially as the technologies keep moving and we're shifting, so.
And sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's not even necessarily a profit incentive to go into these technologies, or at least not to adopt them quickly. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there's not. So I'm glad that you brought the government and regulation question in. Do we need more government? Don't get mad at me for this. Do we need more government mandates, or at least quicker decisions from regulatory bodies to promote these types of creative solutions?
I think everybody in this room would be in favor of quicker solutions and responses from regulatory bodies. I don't think that's a controversial statement. We need the pace of government to start keeping up with the pace of innovation here, so that we can achieve whatever the path is
we
for
can't keep changing
the country. We can't do it if the pace of the regulatory body isn't the same as what needs to be done to keep up and keep the lights on.
I think Jason earlier said that the country needs 3 to 4 pieces of major legislation. We're talking probably more overarching issues than the technology issues that we're talking about, but to kind of loop in permitting, I think Jason had mentioned critical minerals, judicial review. Do you all see the needs as that expansive, like 3 to 4 more pieces of legislation, big ones, just from Congress alone? Derrick, I haven't heard from you in a while. Do you think it needs to be that broad of an intervention?
I think we've seen the first part of that question. I think we've seen it since 2015 that the government has had a little bit too much of a hand in not getting us to where we are. So, I'd like to see a little bit less government. I think where they play a role is spurring the industry to get us where we need to be. But as far as look at the current state of where we're at. It is changing, and the technology is different. And so I go back to 2015 when I started really focusing in on behalf of labor what was really going on and really trying to understand and define what clean energy was for labor unions. But I think we've seen it, that we are in the position that we're in because maybe we've had too much government. That's our view.
Yeah, to your question about permitting, for sure. But it's not going to be one or two things. I mean, it's a continuum. I think where we need to ultimately go is going to be so vastly different than where we are right now. We'll look back and say, man, we were idiots for not doing this sooner. I mean, we have to be able to build things, and we can't. And if you look at the sheer size of what remaining economically competitive on top of some form of decarbonization, I mean, we have to build a lot of stuff, and we just can't do that. Like I said, there is bipartisan support there, and a realization that both sides want to go in the same direction. They just need to work out the details.
If I heard you correctly, Christopher, I think in an earlier answer you said that we're building right now about 650 miles of new transmission a year nationwide, and I think I read a few weeks ago that 10 years ago, roughly, we'd actually built 4,000 miles a year. Is that, because that seems to be a really dramatic tail off at a time when we probably need transmission more than we have. Did I get those numbers right? And what's going on there?
I don't think it was quite 4,000, but from 2000 to 2010, I think the rate was about 1,500 miles a year. And in the subsequent decade, it dropped to less than 700. And again, almost none of that is interstate. I mean, that's what we really need. We need to be able to build the renewables at the utility scale where they're most efficient, which generally is not where people live. It's in the desert Southwest. It's in the plains for wind, and then be able to string lines to get it to the load centers. We can't do that. I mean, we all cheer when an interstate transmission line finally gets approved after 15 years. I mean, that's just, it's inconceivable that we're ever going to get from point A to point B without just a massive overhaul. And I'll make one plug. The Aspen Institute, led by two former CEQ chairs, one Democratic in Katie McGinty and one Republican in Jim Connaughton, they put together a white paper about a year and a half ago that really gets to the quick. It's, if we're going to do what we say we want to do, we're going to have to find a way to skip straight to deemed approved. There are certain projects that fit where we need to go, and if we're building it in certain areas that we want to build them, then bam, without any of the legal wrangling that ties things up. I mean, at the end of the day, it shouldn't take longer to cite a project than it does to construct it.
Can I just,
please, Diane.
I just think it's also important to remember what might not be, the sexy things. That NERC, for the first time, said state policies are part of the problem. That doesn't mean that state policies get rid of state policies, but it does mean what are we doing to look, if we might be part of the problem, we need to address that. We need to look at that. FERC issued with NERC a report on Winter Storm Elliott, directly talked about some of the challenges with, the winter 2022, December, Christmas Eve challenges for Con Ed and other utilities in New York and the problems that we would have had. So the reality is that we're missing the signals to really look at going back to what we're good at, which is really valuing the energy planning process from a technical perspective, an operational perspective, and really looking at making sure that we are addressing the system constraints and addressing the supply issues and the growth of demand that's coming, and to try to make sure that we're not literally just waiting on and hoping that chewing gum and shoestrings are going to get us through.
We're in our final minute here, and if I've read the Constitution correctly, as a reporter, I'm legally obligated to ask you all about politics in an election year. And we also do have one audience question about 2024 too. So I'd love it if one or two of you wants to conclude with how you're reading the differences between our major candidates on the demand growth issue, on the grid, and how divergent the country might handle this going into 2025, how divergent Washington and the federal government might be in responding to these issues in 2025 and going forward the next 5 or 10 years, depending on how 2024 turns out?
Don't think you can find an issue area where there's more disparate viewpoints. And we've already seen it. We've had a Trump administration, we have a Biden administration. I mean, it's the biggest pendulum swing going from Obama to Trump to Biden. Whether that happens or the pendulum keeps going, I mean, look, let's be clear. I said it before. We haven't talked about it. I mean, this EPA is purportedly about to finalize a power plant rule that would require any new gas plants built in about 10 years to be able to either have 80% carbon capture or 80% hydrogen co-fire. Both of those are wildly unrealistic with the current technology. So we see all of this demand coming, and then we have an EPA that's trying to, cut us off at the knees to ensure that we don't have the most reliable form of power. At the end of the day, that pendulum swing makes it really difficult for my members to be able to make long-term capital decisions, and I think that's one of the reasons why Congress needs to be a lot more involved in these things.
Even on transmission and clean energy, do the rest of you have confidence that the work that the private sector is doing and what some of the states wants, that a Trump EPA would help with that, or a Trump administration broadly would help?
I've been a public servant for 28 years and have been through numerous administrations, both at the federal level and the state level. And I think it's important for us to really stick to our bread and butter and look at trying to have policies in place that are not going to just be for the current administration, but really trying to last through and really set some true responsible energy regulation in place. We can't lose sight of that, and we have to really focus on that.
Well, thank you all so much. I don't want to go any more over time. I hope everyone in the audience could give a big round of applause for our panelists today.